Hey chaps, I hope you're all well. Today we're going to be covering tile layers. Now what this will allow us to do is essentially stack tiles on top of one another and be able to see how they look in tandem. So one example would be to place a floor and then a plant pot on top of that floor, and there'll be two completely different tiles, but you can see them together in tandem, and that's where tile layers come in. Of course, this opens up many different doors, such as being able to control transitions between different tile types, such as grass to gravel, etc., if you've made the correct assets for doing so. So this is a major part of the engine, and we need to get this done. So let's get right to it. So to get us started, over in Visual Studio, we're going to do some work in the engine project. So if we open the engine project, go to Tile Maps and then the map class, you'll see in here we have our tiles variable. This is currently a 2D array representing the X and the Y for that map. However, now we're going to talk about the concept of tile layers. We want this variable to exist on a layer by layer basis. So we need to introduce another element to this array or move it into its own class, which is what I'm going to do. So if we look at our tiles variable, we have a load of references to that variable in this class, so it's used quite a lot. So a lot of this code we're actually going to move into the layer part of the map. So what we're going to do now is create the tile layer class to house a lot of this information. So in the tile maps folder for the engine project, we're going to right click, add a new item, and we're going to create the tile layer class. Okay. In this tile layer class, we're going to move some of the stuff that we have in this map class right now over into the tile layer class, such as this variable here. So we're going to do that right now. So I'm going to take this variable, I'm going to remove it from the map class at the same time, so I'm going to delete that. And then I'm going to paste that into our new tile layer class. Okay, so that's the first leg of our journey of moving over some of the logic to the layer. The next thing we need to do is move over this logic here where we instantiate all the tiles. Currently this happens at the map level, but we want to start doing this at the layer level, okay, because we want the tiles to exist on a layer by layer basis. So, with that said, we're going to take a lot of this code in this constructor and move that over to the layer as well. So I'm going to do a direct copy of this constructor, of the map constructor, move that over to the layer, paste that in here, and I'm just going to rename this map constructor to tile layer. Okay, so currently we're using the tile width and the tile height in this constructor. I'm going to keep that for now because we may need it later on, and it saves us having to refer back to the map class repeatedly as well. Okay, so I'm going to store those in here too. In fact, I'm just copy and pasting from the map class. Take these and paste them above tiles. Okay. And then we'll add the namespace for the color variable as well, or the color structure rather. Control period, add using Microsoft XNA framework. Okay. And then we need to look at moving over some of the other code as well. So first of all, we can remove this from the map constructor. What we will do in here is actually add a new list to hold all the layers instead of just the tiles. So we'll add a new list, private list tile layer, and we'll just call this layers. And we'll instantiate that in the map constructor. So that is in place of creating all the tiles. We'll now start adding layers, and they can be responsible for creating the tiles instead. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to add my first layer as a default when I create a new map. So I'm going to create layers, add new tile layer, and I'm going to pass in the same information that we're using here because it's using the same constructor pretty much. So I'm going to pass in tile width, tile height, and then width, and then height. So that's our default layer added right there. Okay, moving on now, we're going to start looking at the draw logic. So we've got a lot of logic in here for drawing the tiles, but now we're talking about layer by layer basis, so we're going to move this for loop and this for loop here into the layer class instead. So I'm going to copy this over, and I'm going to create a draw method in the tile layer class. Okay, so in fact, I'm going to copy the whole draw method from map, and I'm going to chop and change it a little bit in the layer class. So I'll paste that in here. We'll add the relevant namespaces, so sprite batch, control period, Microsoft XNA framework graphics, add one for the camera, MonoGame extended, and then we have our tile sets as before. Okay, so the reason I'm copying these methods over as well, it's important to know that, it's just to make sure I don't miss anything and we make sure we've got everything we need that we had in the map class. We're not missing anything as we go along. So we don't need the immediate tiles in here, so we can remove that for loop here as well. And we'll get rid of this clear of the list. And what I'm going to do is remove this sprite batch begin and end because it's going to be the tile map's responsibility for doing that. So it saves us doing this on a layer by layer basis. So I'm going to remove this call here and remove this call here. And then this is just responsible for going through literally just the tiles for this layer and drawing them. Okay. So back in the map class now, what I'm going to do is remove these for loops here and create some new ones, or just one, which is going to cycle through the layers. Okay, so starting at 0, I under tile layers, or we called it layers, didn't we? Layers.count, I plus plus, and then we'll go layers I or draw, and I'll just pass in the same variables, so p sprite batch, camera, and tile sets. Okay. So now what this is going to do, instead of go through each of the tiles, it's just going to go through the layers in the order in which they are in the list and draw that layer. That layer is now responsible for drawing the tiles on that layer. Okay, so we have that extra level of tiles. So that's a draw method done. What we're now going to look at is actually refactoring this get tile at position method to now accept a layer, because it's important now that we start specifying the layer, because the tiles can be different depending on the layer you're on. To do that, we're now effectively going to break this up into two different methods now. The first one is going to be pretty much what you see here, but at the tile layer level, as of course it is now the tile layer which owns the tiles. The second is going to be a skeletal version of this method which calls through to the layers. Okay, so to get started, we're going to copy this method wholesale, and we're going to paste it into the tile layer class. The second thing we need to do is make sure we copy over the tile position detail class. As you can see, we've got an error here. So go to the bottom of the map class. I'm going to cut this class because we're no longer going to need it here, and remove the white space, and we're going to paste that into the tile layer class. Okay, so like I say, it is now the tile layer's responsibility for providing this information, and now the layer is all working. Of course, we're not using this method in our editor, we're always calling through to the map. The only thing we now need to provide to the map is a layer index. Okay, so we know which layer we're getting a tile from. So we're going to pass in an int layer index, and we're also going to fix this error here. So to fix that, we now need to refer to the new home of this class, which is the tile layer. Oh, can't spell it. There we go. Okay, and the next thing we need to do is just add some checks in here to make sure you're expecting, or rather you're passing, a valid layer index. So what is a valid layer index? Okay, so if layer index is less than 0, it's invalid. Or if layer index is greater than or equal to the number of layers, then we know that's invalid. So we'll just return a null from that. Okay, so it's not even remotely valid at this point. We can't even hazard a guess at whether it's a valid position or not. You've just given a completely invalid layer index. The next thing we need to do, and the only thing we need to do left in this class, is just return layers layer index dot get tile position and pass in the position. Okay, all of this remaining code here is now redundant, so we can just remove that. We have one remaining error to deal with here, and that is an inconsistent accessibility problem. That is because the tile layer class itself is not public, and the classes all around it are, such as this one. So it's public map, public method. It now expects this class to be public as well. The class itself is public, but the owning class, which is the layer, is not. This is defaulted to private or internal. So I'm going to put public here. Of course, we'll need to access these in the editor as well if we want to create them. And now that fixed our errors in the map class, and we have no errors in the layer class. So a lot of this is pretty much ready to go now. We now need to move on to the next piece of work, which of course is going to be getting our editor compiling once more. So let's give this a real quick build and see what the errors are. Okay, so they're both in the editor class. So if we double click on the first error, this should take you to this error here, complaining that the tile position detail class no longer exists in map, which it doesn't, as we moved it to tile layer. So we're going to change this to tile layer, and then get tile position, of course, is going to be expecting a layer index. And for now, just to make sure everything's working, we're going to assume that we have an index of 0, which is the initial layer that we created in the constructor. Let's give that a quick start to make sure everything's working. So here's our tile map here, which is a good sign. Let's select a tile set and make sure painting works, which it does. And paint a couple of different tile types in there, make sure it's all working. Okay, so that all looks good. So we've fixed our errors now. We've got a compiling and working editor once more. We now need to just start expanding the scope of our tile layer functionality. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a way of viewing our tile layers in the editor. So we can then select one and then subsequently paint onto it. So over in the editor project, we're going to go to Form1CS, right click and view designer. In here, we're going to open up the toolbox. We're going to find list box, and then we're just going to plonk one down into the editor. So drag that out And I'm going to position that underneath our tile set previewer and make it a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to give this a sensible name. So in the bottom right here, I'm going to call this list box layers. That'll do. Okay, so I'm done with the designer for now, and I'm going to close that down. Okay, so the next thing we need to work out is how to get the information of those tile layers up to the list box that we just created. Of course, the editor owns the map, and the layers are on that map. So the first thing we're going to do is when we create a new map, we want to basically say, hey guys, here's a new map that I've created. Do with that information what you will. At which point the form can basically pick up on that and say, okay, cool, I want your layers, and I'm going to put them in this list box. So we're going to create an event, much like we did before in our tile set previewer control. The first thing we're going to do, however, is we have two different ways of creating maps currently. One is this way in the initialize method, and then the second way is calling this create map method when we use the create new map menu. So I'm going to consolidate this now, so this initialize part here uses our method down here. So I'm going to remove this assignment of my map, as the method does that for us. I'm going to remove new map, and I'm just going to call create map. One thing I do remember, however, is that the map width, map height, tile width, and tile height are the wrong way round. So when we create a new map, we passed in tile size and then map size. This method expects map size and then tile size. Okay, so we need to swap these two around, which is a little bit annoying, but at least now it's a little bit more consistent. So instead of 32, 32, 10, 10, we now have 10, 10, 32, 32. Okay, so now we are consistently using this method here. The next thing we need to do is create an event and fire that from here, so we have that information floating around in the ether to say, I've created a new map, here's the information. So what we're going to do, as a typical developer, I'm not going to write out a new event, as I can never remember how to write them. I'm going to go to controls here, tile set previewer, and view code. I'm going to copy the existing event that we have in here. And then I'm going to go back to our MonoGame editor control, and I'm going to paste that along the top here. And now I'm just going to chop and change this a little bit to be a little bit more suitable to our use case. So I'm going to call this handler on new map handler. Okay, and I'm just going to pass in the map, new map. And then this event name is actually going to be called just new map. So when we create the new map in our method here, we're going to fire that event. So new map question mark. So this basically says if I'm null, don't do anything, but if I do have handlers, invoke them. And then we're going to pass in my map. Okay, so we have that event now firing from this control. This doesn't care about getting those layers and display them in the list box. It shouldn't do. This is just displaying and rendering them. So now if I just give that a quick build to make sure that's all working. Okay, now over in the form, if I right click and view designer, in here if I select my MonoGame editor control, which is where we just created that event, if I scroll down, select the events lightning bolt here, and then scroll down to, I believe it's under MISC. Here it is, here's our new map event. Double click on there, and then now in our form class we have this event which fires when a new map is created. So that will be the first map that is created by default and any more that are created via the new map menu. In here we can now add some code to populate that list box with the tile layers. But before we can do that, we need to make our layers accessible to us. If we go to the map class, in here we have our list of tile layers, but is currently private. So what we're going to do is move this and make this a public property. So I'm going to paste this to the top, remove it. I'm going to make this public. I'm going to right click on the name of it here, rename, and give this a capital L for layers. This is now a public property. I'm going to give this a get and a private set. Okay, so we don't want to reinstantiate or reset the whole list from outside of this class, but we can freely add or remove from it. So back in the form now, all I'm going to do is add a for loop. So for in I equals 0, I under new map dot layers dot count with capital L I plus plus. In here, all I'm going to do is get our list box, so it's called list box layers dot items dot add, and pass in new map dot layers I. Okay, so if we give this a quick run now, hit start, we'll start up our editor, and then we have our list down here with one item in it. But it just looks a little bit ugly as it's got the whole name of the class in there, much like what happened with our tile sets at the beginning of that piece of work. So all we need to do, much like the tile sets, is an override to the toString method. So in our tile layer class, scroll to the bottom here, just above our class here, I'm going to put override toString, and then we can give it a little bit more of a sensible name. But we don't have a name variable for tile layers, okay? So what we're going to do is add another property for that, which can basically represent the name of a layer. So I'm going to call this public string name get set. And then when we create a layer, all I'm going to do is give it an opportunity to specify the default name for that layer. So as another argument on layer here, I'm going to go for string name. And then in here, just under where we set the tile width and tile height, I'm going to go for this. Just do name, capital N equals lowercase name. Okay, and then in our toString at the bottom here, I'm just going to return name. So if we give this a quick build, we should have a little bit of an error to deal with. Yep, and then if we click on that, that'll just take us to where we create our default layer, as it's now expecting a name. So I'm just going to call this base layer. Okay, hit start once more. And then we have our layer here, just called base layer, and there's only one of them, which is entirely correct. What we're going to do now is just add 2 layers, so we have 2 layers to play around with here when we're painting tiles onto them, so you can see the effects of layering in play. So in here, we're on our constructor for our map, just for testing purposes for now, until we add functionality to create layers ourselves. I'm going to add 2 layers. So I'm going to add new layer, same details, but I'm going to call this our second layer. Okay, I'm going to hit F5 to give that a run again. And there we have it, it's displaying both our layers. Okay, the next thing we need to start thinking about is adding some functionality so that when we click on these layers, it becomes the active layer, so we're painting onto that layer. You can do this any way you want, guys. If you have a better way of dealing with it, a more user experience friendly way of doing it, be my guest, do whatever you'd like to do. I'm just going to go for this way for ease of explanation and just go through the steps of what we're doing. So what we need to do is add an event handler, so when we click on a layer, it becomes the layer that we're then painting on, okay? So let's go ahead and add that bad boy right now. So over in the Form 1 Designer, I'm going to select our list box layers. In the events lightning bolt here, I'm going to find the event for selected index changed. And double click on there to generate the event handler for us. Okay, so we've got our selected index changed event, which tells us a selection has been made. So what we then need to do is notify the MonoGame editor control that we have changed our active layer. But first, of course, we need some way of storing that. So in our MonoGame editor class, I'm going to bring that forward here. I'm going to add another variable in here, which is going to be an int, which represents our active layer. So we're going to public int active layer get set. Okay, and this can basically just be the index of that selection in the list box. So it's relatively simple. So in the form1cs file here, we're going to basically say MonoGame editor 1 dot active layer equals listbox layers dot selected index. And that's it. That's all we need to think about. Okay, so with that said, we now have a way of selecting the layer that we want to paint on. We then need to just make sure we're painting onto that layer. So over in the MonoGame editor control, if you scroll down to our update method, you'll remember before that we set a assumption of a painting to index 0 on the layer index here. All we really need to do is just change this to be active layer. So what that means is it's going to get the tile at the position on the active layer, and then down here, as before, it will then paint that tile onto the tile it's found at that position. So that should just work. So if we give that a quick run now, and then we select a tile set, we'll paint that. So I'll select our base layer here, paint that, and you'll see nothing's actually showing up. If we select our second layer and paint again, it shows up as expected. The reason for that being is because on both layers we are painting these colors, and the top layer is just painting over the top of the bottom layer, so you can't see anything underneath. So we need to think twice about how we're actually painting these colors, or if it even really matters. So if we close down the editor, so what we're going to do now is we're going to change how we draw those background colors. If we head over to the tile class, you'll see how it works currently is we draw a solid white rectangle followed by a smaller solid rectangle of the background color. Now I must admit there was a pretty naive approach when we did it originally, as we could have just used draw rectangle to give the effect of a border. But anyhow, what we're going to do now moving forward is we're going to draw a solid slab of colour underneath all the layers, and then moving forward eventually we could potentially just draw one grid over the top of them all. But I have big plans for the Tilemap engine moving forwards. This is not the finished product and it's not very efficient, but we just need this to explain a lot of the concepts. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this line here, the fill rectangle for the white, we're going to go to the map class, and then before we draw the layers we're going to draw a huge rectangle. So we're going to take the sprite batch here and we're going to draw a fill rectangle, and the position for this is going to be vector2.0 because the whole map is drawn from 0, 0 onwards, and then the size of it is going to be the tile width and tile height multiplied by the map width and map height. But we don't know the map width and map height because we don't store that information, and when we previously did store it we restrict it out to take it away from the tile arrays themselves. But I think it's going to be useful to introduce that again, as eventually we may have a restriction so that we can only add tile layers that match the tile height, or rather the map width and height. So I'm going to store these once more. I'll just call this width int height, and then I'm going to store this dot width equals width, this dot height equals height. And now we can use that information to draw the big slab of colour. So tile width multiplied by width, and then tile height multiplied by height. Okay, the colour of this, I'm just going to make this, I'm going to make this grey, spell grey correctly. Okay, and then heading back over to the tile class, what I'm going to do is change how this draws to now draw rectangle instead of fill rectangle, and leave everything else the same. I'm going to strip out the colour, so we're no longer going to need that. I'm going to strip the property out for background colour as well. Give this a quick build to deal with the errors it's going to throw at us. We should only have one, maybe two. For some reason they're not showing up. There it is, that took a little while. And here I'm just going to strip out this entirely because we don't need to set a background colour anymore. And that is in the tile layer constructor. Okay, so I'm going to give that a quick run again. So here's our map. It looks a little bit more bland, but there's only one solid block of colour being drawn. And what this now means is if I select the base layer, select the tile set, and then select maybe this tile here, paint that on, it lets me see the base layer, and of course the colour is disappearing as well. It would be very useful, I think, moving forward to introduce a brush size. That might be nice. But now, to see the real power of tile layers, what I can do is select a tile with a transparent background, such as maybe this plant pot here. Select our second layer, and I can just paint that on top, and you'll see it nicely blends in with the background, and there's my layer in action. Of course, if I didn't have the layers and select, say, the base layer, so there's only one like we had previously, it would override the tile that is there, and therefore leave the background exposed. So we wouldn't have that effect of layering a plant pot on top of a tile. It would just be a plant pot laid on top of a grey background, which is not fun. Okay, so if there's one more thing I'd like to tackle today before calling this episode done, is I want to be able to make it so that when we load up a map, it selects the base layer by default, so that we don't have to click on it ourselves manually. So in the Form1 CS class here, just to give this a quick run, just to show you how it's working currently, if I start up the editor, there is no layer selected, and if I select full tile set and paint on, it assumes to be the bottom layer, but it's not showing up down here, okay? Because it just defaults to 0. That's the only way that is working, but there's no visual representation of it working that way. So what I'm going to do when we load a new map is I'm just going to select that bottom layer by default by going for list box layers selected index equals 0. Okay, so I'm going to give that a quick run again. The functionality will remain the same, we just have that visual cue that we're now selected and working on the base layer. Okay, so that's just working as it did before. Okay, excellent. So once again, guys, thanks for tuning into this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. There are many things we can add to improve the tile layer functionality. There are things missing from the editor that we could add to add them, rename them, delete them, change the order of them, all these things that we could add, and that's not a problem, but I'm also keen to move on to different features and functionality of the game in the engine overall. So we'll just see how we go and where the wind takes us. Thanks once again, chaps, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll speak to you soon.